You know, back when I was in the academy, we would follow every toast with a song.
Hi everyone, welcome to Where No Bubs Has Gone Before, a Star Trek The Next Generation podcast hosted by myself, Jay Reckward, and my father, Jake Reckward. We're recording this for the benefit of my son, Ben, but we know there's so many great Star Trek fans out there. We're putting the show out for free on YouTube. How are you doing tonight, Jake?
I'm good, Jay, and you?
I'm really excited. Tonight we are reviewing Star Trek The Next Generation, Season 2, Episode 20, The Emissary, which debuted on June 26, 1989, and has a star date of 42901.3.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to say, this is probably my favorite episode out of Season 2, and one of my favorite Star Trek episodes to watch when it comes on. I've seen this so many times that I can't even really count anymore, but I love it from beginning to end.
I think it's pretty good too. I particularly with the card game opening scene, the poker poker game. They're always fun. Just the personal interplay it allows between the different characters, and particularly where you've got people of different cultures. Troy's in there, Worf's in there, so on.
Well, let's actually start with the poker scene.
Yeah.
So Worf, it's actually Worf, Data, LaForge, Dr. Pulaski, and Riker who are playing poker. And Data suggests after Worf makes a big bet, that Worf doesn't understand the full nuances of the game. Riker points out that Worf has been the biggest winner of the day, implying that Data shouldn't underestimate Worf's skills. Data expresses that Worf's success isn't due to anything other than random chance. But Worf in the end bluffs and wins once again on a big hand. Worf, however, insists that Klingons never bluff, and I think that this is actually a really good opening scene for not only, as you describe, showing the viewer how these people engage off hours, and how their cultures interplay with each other.
Mm-hmm.
In some ways, even in the subtle ways that, even if it's a passing of a phrase, it still has a lot of impact, and it plays directly into the episode.
It does, correct, yeah.
What do you think about Worf's statement that Klingons do not bluff? Because that will come back in the episode, but it'll also come back through many other episodes.
I don't know what to make of that. It's almost just kind of like, one theme that comes up is Klingon guile. So guile is a form of bluff. So I think that maybe Worf says Klingons never bluff because they don't see it as an honorable thing rather than just going straight on and punching somebody in the nose.
Well, there's a difference between, I think the way the Klingons would probably describe it is that there is a certain amount of courage and cunning, but there's a cowardice in just stabbing someone in the back.
Right.
And I think what Worf is expressing here is that he really doesn't have the capacity. He doesn't make the plan or the intention to actually lie when he comes at you or deceive you. He may trick you, but it's not actually... There's no deception in his approach. And I think that's really important because it builds on the character in terms of not only his interplay with Kalar, but also his main interplay with the mission. So let's actually jump right into the main mission.
Sure.
The poker game is interrupted when the USS Enterprise D receives an urgent confidential message from Starfleet Command to divert course without any details. Picard is quoted as saying, "Whenever Starfleet gets enigmatic, I know we're about to face a challenge," which he tells Riker before the Enterprise goes to warp speed and we actually begin the episode. The crew is informed by an Admiral Gromek that they are to pick up a special emissary who will assist them on a very important mission. This emissary is being sent from Starbase 153 aboard a Class 8 probe. Riker expresses his disbelief, but
Yeah.
Picard mentions that if you remove the transmitters and sensors from the probe and had a life support system installed, there would be enough room for a single person. Uh, in a very daring attempt, they rendezvous with the probe at Warp 9, I think in the Barada system,
Correct. Yes.
and they transport the probe carrying Ambassador Kalar, who is a half-human, half-Klingon diplomat serving the Federation, and somewhat as a liaison to the Klingon Empire, or the Klingon High Council. And I have to say, this segment that they have here where they transport her on board with the probe, um, story-wise, I think is very, very interesting because it brings up a lot of questions about how high-risk missions are conducted by Starfleet. And this reminded me a lot of a Halo jump. So for those of you not listening, a Halo jump is basically you send soldiers on a plane at high altitude and they jump. First to avoid the radar, but as they're passing through the radar zone, when they get to the bottom of it, which is usually pretty low altitude, they let go of their chutes and they float down to the ground where they begin their mission. This is a highly dangerous thing to do because of the load altitude challenge. You really have to be precise about when you pull your chute, and there's a lot of other things that are involved. But this reminds me a lot of kind of like someone performing a Halo jump and them having to be picked up for a mission. There's very much a James Bond like quality to it.
Yeah, I think that the fact that when they open up the probe container and find someone in there, that she's got that full face mask on, because soldiers who do Halo,
Right.
since they're jumping as high as 30,000 feet or so, they have to have supplementary oxygen till they get down to a level of altitude in the atmosphere where they have enough uh, uh, oxygen. The one question, technical or engineering question I have about this Class 8 probe, they said it's capable of warp 9. How can
So
this thing be? How can this thing be capable of warp
I,
9?
I thought about that question for a little bit, and one of the things that doesn't get played with in this show but gets played with in Voyager, which I know you're watching now, on a regular basis, is that there are these things called warp slingshots or warp sleds, where
Hmm.
essentially you could create a warp field and throw an object into it and basically slingshot it at a certain speed towards a destination. So my assumption is they're doing one of two things. They either have some way at Starbase 153 to throw Kalar's probe forward, or they're actually like loading her into a ship and launching her to a ship. But I also have to imagine, like, I started thinking about photon torpedoes. How fast are photon torpedoes actually going when they're launched? Are they going at warp speed? Can they be launched at warp speed? Um,
Oh, let's see. Well, there's situations where, like, the Enterprise is being chased by the Borg, and yeah,
right.
they will fire photon torpedoes. Yeah,
Exactly. So I don't think actually, and we know that the torpedo is actually a physical object that they are able to launch, and maybe this is purely sci-fi and the science doesn't work.
right, sure,
But in the Star Trek universe, they're able to launch a solid object at warp 9. So
yeah,
maybe they're able to do that too, and not
yeah,
completely plaster Kalar on the inside.
right, right.
Because one thing that I did have a problem with this, and I think you ask a very good question about how this is possible. If they launched a probe at warp 9, Does she have some sort of warp field around her, or some sort of deflector system to keep things like interstellar dust,
Well,
or
that's the other issue is that if it's going at warp 9, how does it sustain that um, velocity? Even though it probably doesn't have any resistance, like you're saying, if you can
right?
slingshot it somehow into a warp speed, then that might answer that. But yeah, I mean, how the cylinder that she was in was very thin, so they must have had some very small microsystems for life support and things like that.
Well, we know that in the Star Trek universe in the future, one of their metals that they use a lot is, I think, deuterium. Not deuterium's the fuel. Um,
Deuterium, yeah, is a hydrogen
deuterium's a fuel.
isotope, right?
Yeah, deuterium's a fuel. It begins with a D, and it sounds like titanium or
Yeah, I think they
duratanium or
they call
something.
it tritanium, duratanium, something like
Yeah,
that.
I've
Yeah,
heard tritanium too.
right. Yeah.
Um, I think that in the future they will probably be able to process materials that you can construct very thinly, but be able to throw at high warp speeds if we had something like warp drive in the future. But
Hmm.
if you're able to construct something that you can throw at warp 9, I would have to imagine you live in a universe where you can construct the materials to make it do so as well.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, and at the same, but we also have to get into the question like, how thick are the bulkheads on the Enterprise D in terms of the actual scale of the size?
Hmm.
How thick are is everything a force field that keeps the pressure within the ship, or is it actual glass or some sort of glass, or a transparent aluminum, as
Right.
Dr. Coy reveals in Star Trek for The Voyage Home?
Yes. Sure. Yeah.
I think there's some questions there of how all that works. But if you have transparent aluminum, I guess that the next possible step. Well, we're kind of getting off track, but I would imagine that you would actually be able at this point, if you had replicators and you were able to replicate different molecules in different sequences, that you would able. I wouldn't be surprised if Starfleet doesn't have new metals that it comes up with every few decades or something after tinkering around with it. Because if you can tinker around with protons and proteins and all that stuff, why
Sure.
can't you do it
Yeah.
with metallurgy?
Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
So, I think it's just something we don't see.
Right.
But the main story really is about the romantic tension between Worf and Kalar, with the secondary story actually being about the reawakening of the Tong, which was a ship that was sent out um, on a top secret mission during the last Klingon and Federation war many, many years ago. The crew of the Tong were actually placed in cryogenic sleep with the idea that they would wake up far into the future and continue the possible Klingon Federation war. Unfortunately, the Klingons and the Federation have come to a peace and a very deep-seated alliance. So, of course, both sides want to mitigate any sort of damage that the Tong might inflict, especially in the Barada system, which apparently has just been colonized by the
Hmm.
Federation. But I was
Right.
actually looking up the Barada system. If it's been colonized by the Federation, this at some point had to have been a Klingon sector of space.
Hmm.
Because I was looking on a map for the Alpha Quadrant, and I'll
Hmm.
link it in the description to the YouTube clip. But the Barada system is north of the Beta Quadrant. Well, quote unquote north. Um, and apparently it is the spot for that planet where Kalis is waiting in a
Hmm.
future episode, I
Hmm.
think. Um,
Hmm.
but it's very interesting that they're going into a sector of space where they're worried about colonies being attacked.
Hmm.
It makes you really wonder, like, what was the Klingons' long-term goals really when they sent out this sleeper ship? Do you have anything that you would like to speculate when it comes to the Tong and its mission and probably the nature of it? I
I
have some
have
speculation, but I
I hadn't really thought of it a lot, but brought that up in terms of maybe it's on memory alpha as to what the intent was. But
Actually, I looked there and there wasn't a lot of written intent. It
I
was
mean,
just they were kind of sent out there.
the only thing I can think of is did the Klingons know when they were going to come out of their cryogenic state so that they could be watching for it? Because if they knew, then they had programmed that. And the only thing I can figure that possibly make some sense is that if the Klingons had lost the war or the war was still going on and they needed some extra vessels and so forth for the Tong being hidden and the crew coming back to life, it would give them a tactical boost. Then
Right.
still doesn't make a lot of sense, really.
The only thing that I can think of, because, you know, it's very odd to send one ship out into space with the idea that you're going to put these people to sleep and then they're going to wake up and wreak havoc.
Yeah.
Um, I'm imagining that they probably sent out multiple sleeper ships, but over time they either collected them or they were destroyed or something happened, and that this is probably the one that got away in the bureaucracy. But my imagining is that, during the Klingon Federation War, I would imagine the Klingons looked around and said, "Oh, okay, there's a chance we can lose. And if we lose, the Federation is most likely going to wipe us out because we're warriors. And they're warriors, and warriors kill each other. We don't make peace and we don't have hostages. That's the Klingon way." Um, I bet you they sent out a bunch of sleeper ships with the idea like, okay, if we lose in 80 years' time or 40 years' time or whatever time has passed since the last war, these Klingons will wake up and continue the cause.
Well, as you started describing that, that was the popped into my mind. It's their delayed doomsday machine. If we
Right,
lose and the Federation wins, we're still going to win in the long run because all of these ships will pop up, and they'll surprise the Federation.
but even then, that
But
is,
but as you said, you couldn't do that with just one ship.
well, even if you did it with, let's say you sent out a fleet of ships, there's still a real downside to that strategy because you have to account that in the 80-year time span or whatever, um, not only are they going to know about the reawakening, well, like the Empire didn't even know about the awakening until they got like a signal from the Tong that they were awakening. So, like, it was probably lost in the bureaucracy. But even then, like, you're sending all these ships out, you're leaving all these Klingons asleep. A lot can happen in 80 years in terms of weapons technology. You know, it. What happens in the 80-year period if the Klingons suddenly had a war with the Romulans and lost to the Romulans, or the Romulans destroyed both the Federation and the Klingons, or vice versa? Like, a lot happens in 80 years. So the premise of it just doesn't make a lot of sense.
Well, and again, it comes down to the writers wrote this part of the story so that it would create,
Right.
fit in with the relationship between Kalar and Worf, and they'd have that common problem that they would have to work with Picard with to solve.
Right.
Yeah.
And it should be mentioned that the writers of the story, Richard Manning, Hans Beamer, and Thomas Calder, they really did put together a story that the writers really liked. And I have to say, when it comes to the story of Kalar and Worf, this episode is really well put together in terms of dealing with the relationship dynamics of two different cultures clashing. And in some ways, like, you have two characters that embody that clash of cultures, but they deal with that clash of cultures in two very different ways, especially in terms of how they value things.
Well, yeah. I think that's the real key, the interesting
Hmm.
thing here, because you bring up the clash of cultures or cultural conflict, and there's the one uh, conversation that Troy and Kayla are having as they're walking
Right,
down the passageway, and it becomes clear, that um, Troy is half Betazoid and half human, and but her growing up was not uh, too Maltuous she wasn't in conflict as much as Kalar was, because
Well, she's a princess.
The Betazoid and human Terran cultures, are simpatical. They're different, but
Yeah.
they're um, they kind of fit together well.
Right. They can assimilate together very well.
Assimilate's the right term. Whereas you take a Klingon and a human, those cultures are so different. You're just going to have a lot of friction, and a child of that sort of union, regardless of where they are. Well, here's an interesting thing. Kalar, I guess, grew up on Kronos. So
Yeah.
it sounds like, she's got that Klingon rage, her dominant character seems to be, well, it's pretty well balanced, but it kind of defaults to the Klingon side.
Yeah.
And the other one that's interesting, and just in terms of cultural conflict, which is kind of midway between the rather fierce conflict that Kalar has versus the milder conflict, or mild, if any conflict that Troy has, is Spock.
Yeah.
Because there was some tension, there was some cultural misalignment between humans and Vulcans, from what we understand.
I think the show does some very interesting things when it talks about relations between the different species when it comes to intermarriage and interracial relations, especially in the producing of children. You cited Spock, and Kalar's a very good example of where the the human side that they come from is always welcoming and accepting of. It doesn't matter. Like Worf's parents in Russia, the humans that adopted him, didn't care that he was a Klingon. A Klingon in the Empire would care that Kalar is half human. There is a automatic racial prejudice that isn't automatically stated in Klingon culture, but it is there. And there is a real sense of like racial purity. And the Romulans have a sense too. Like they punished I think Commander Salo, who's played by Denise Crosby,
Mm-hmm.
Tasha Yar's daughter.
Mm-hmm.
She even says, she suffered some discrimination because of being half human.
Mm-hmm.
Star Trek kind of, in many ways, asserts that it's often humans that are more welcoming and accepting of different species and different cultures, and the meeting of the two. More often than the outside cultures they have to deal with, which do carry a large degree of xenophobia, like the Klingons do. The Klingons are deeply, deeply xenophobic because they believe that their culture is under assault all the time. Um, and in some ways, like, I think you have an interesting dichotomy in this episode because you have Worf, who is fully Klingon, but he's raised by humans. But he's so desperate to be a Klingon that it it's almost surprising that he ends up with Kalar, because Kalar is so desperate to have her humanity versus being dominated by her Klingon side that they really are like the flip side of. They are the two sides of the same coin. They're dealing with the same problem, just from two different angles.
Putting it to a more practical basis, there's probably some papers, some books that have been written on uh, cross national, cross cultural relationships just on the planet now.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, uh, European American marrying a Chinese,
Yeah.
a German marrying a woman from Sudan, um, a white American male marrying a woman who was born in El Salvador.
Oh,
Um,
my neighbor's a gay British Indian man who married white a white Southern man from North Carolina.
so there's and so it's interesting, just to think about what this kind of points out, that here we're talking about interspecies relationships and how their cultures and background would conflict. And, we've got this same drama going on with our neighbors and people all the time,
Right.
uh, particularly that you've got a lot, it's much more frequent to see relationships with children between different races. I mean, it wasn't that way 70 years ago, we know.
Right. Well, um I think in many ways that cultural occurrence that is happening here now, it was natural, I think a natural feature of the globalizing nature of the last 70 years. Like, there was no way that we were going to be able to keep all of these separate cultures and separate people separate from, separated from each other without them intermarrying and, intermingling. And that really is kind of the byproduct of greater levels of communication technology, our ability to travel in
Hmm.
ways that 70 years ago, it really did cost you an arm and a leg to travel across the ocean.
Well, and that's a good point, is just what the internet has done, what email
Right,
has done. I mean, cell phones, current mobile phones, the network is amazing. That
right.
if you have the telephone number of a business colleague or a friend in Beijing, we could get on our iPhones right now and call him. I could call him, and I could add you in on the three-way call.
Oh, we can actually look at each other on camera too.
And now we've got Zoom and Google Meets and all of that.
You know, at some point, the levels of technology, the levels of technology springing forth like they did, we're just going to create this situation that we have now where, you know, I think the beauty of what we're seeing around us is that a lot of people have come to the realization that we're all just human beings, and that these differences that we had, that we thought were across racial and class and gender and political lines, really were culturally constructed. And once you actually meet these people and have conversations with them, you discover that despite your culture, you can still love them. And if anything, it changes both cultures for the better, and it, in some ways, creates new culture. And I think that that is
Yeah,
something to be celebrated.
I think
And
the
Star
community.
Trek, I think, tries to do that, at least on the human side, a lot.
I think what you're talking about in today with the enhancements in communication technology, particularly in the last 20, 25 years, it has a potential for breaking down cultural barriers and people being more acceptive of, people, different races, different cultures, and so forth. And it gets into the last episode where the Antedians,
Right,
were on the Enterprise, and Worf is saying such a handsome race, and um,
Wesley.
Wesley saying it, they look weird to me, and Worf says, "Is that how you reacted to me the first time you saw me?" And
Right,
that was an interesting little lesson, because if you, like my story about my um, personal exposure to African Americans starting in
right,
seventh grade, once you be around someone and you see them not as a threat and you can communicate with them and so forth, then, if they look different, it doesn't become, an issue, a major issue, an impediment.
well, those differences.
You realize that the other is different, but it if you're honestly and openly communicating, you know, the visual difference, whatever, doesn't matter that much anymore.
Well, those differences really are aesthetic next to the actual substance and character of a person.
That's better way to put it. Yes.
Yeah. Um, I think the I think one of the cultural clashes that are happening here, since everything really is about Worf and Kalar here, Klingon customs do seem to indicate that if a couple has a sexual union, they have committed to marriage. Um, this is an interesting thing because later on DS9, Worf and Dax form a relationship that's heavily sexual, and they don't get married until later on. And they have a full Klingon ceremony when they get later on. They get married later on in DS9. But here it is stated that Klingon custom, sex equals marriage. So Worf is trying to, after Worf has this interaction with Kalar in the holodeck, um, he tries to make the honorable decision to marry Kalar, but her human side makes her reluctant to take the Klingon wedding oath, even though she's obviously in love with Worf and is willing to do that. Um, Even to the point of saying, like, what happened between them when they had sex on the holodeck was meaningless, which culturally to Worf it is not. And when he hears that, he says that is a human attitude. So, on one hand, I think that we're seeing some very interesting things being noted about humanity in terms of how we deal with relationships. Because, on one hand, we are very open, or we have the potential to be very open in terms of who we love, cohabitate with, who we have children with, and spend the rest of our lives with. But at the same time, we do have this attitude that certain things that take place within relationships, like sex or physical intimacy, have a certain quality that can be devalued. And I think it's very interesting that Worf says that's a human response when Kalar refuses to take the oath, or says that the oath is meaningless. And in some ways, it gets back to the beginning of the episode with the card game. Like, there's no bluffing in Klingon culture. There's no duplicity. Worf isn't kidding about taking the
Well,
oath, or,
yeah, something you said a while ago,
yeah,
which I think is important here, is that he, after Kittimer and Worf
right,
was orphaned, and he ends up with, the people from Minsk, his parents, and he ends up going to Earth and spending a lot of time
right.
on Earth, where he's, um, persecuted a little bit because of his difference. And that's where probably where it helped Worf wanting to really be a Klingon, so that Klingon custom and honor, and if you have sex with a female, that means you're mated and you should take the oath and so forth. As where, again, Kalar has conflict between, the two cultures she's dealing with. And it seems like, we're almost through season 2 in terms of the little things that come up where there's a possibility of people having sex and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it seemed to be like marriage isn't required. It's very much like, in a sense, how things are, where people will have serious, they'll have serious relationships, or they might have very unserious relationships, one night
Mm-hmm.
stands. And, you know, Kalar, her human side might be reflecting of, what was starting to happen in the 80s and happens now, where sexual relationships are very much, open, to use that
Well, I can say this. One thing that has been startling to me growing up, I'm 35 now. Um, the I was lucky enough to go through middle school where we had 2 years of sex ed, which was a very controversial thing even in North Carolina when we did it. There are people who were like taken out of class, and I believe I was actually taken out of class because you and mom wanted to have the conversation with me, which you did. Um, but the the kind of tenor and the tone of the conversation between my peers when it came to sex back then was so tame compared to what it is now. And I think, again, a lot of that has to do with technology and something called hookup culture. I don't know if you're
Mhm.
familiar with that.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Um, but I think to a certain extent, my generation and the generation Gen Z coming after it really devalued sex down to kind of a transactionary exercise between potential partners, where, like, it's not the most important thing, but, like, it's something that has to be determined to be of import. Um, if a relationship is strangely going to be serious. And it gets into a lot of, like, difficult conversations we have about gender and gender normativity, and, now we're talking about gender critics and stuff. I think a lot of that comes from the fact that sex in general, especially here in the West, has been commodified and to a certain extent dehumanized. There is a certain level of humanity we have removed from the subject to where it really can be talked about in this kind of, and I don't want to sound weird when I say this, even though it's going to sound weird, this kind of unsacred way. Like, we've lost kind of, and I don't want to sound like a conservative or say like the conservative evangelicals right, but like the constant exposure to sex really has kind of diminished the joys, the pleasures, and the specialness of it to where it's just kind of another thing. And I think when you take, and I think when you take something like that, and you make it just another thing, there is something very dangerous that occurs in your society. And I feel the same way with violence. Like, and so I think when you take two things that can be very primal and be very positive, but also be very negative, like sex and violence, and you and you don't have serious conversations about them in society, I really do think bad things happen. Like, the reason why we're having school shootings and we're having mass shootings in 2021 here in America is because the West has a very immature and very malformed relationship when it comes to violence. We don't know how to talk about violence. We don't really know how to disseminate information around violence. And sometimes it feels like we don't know how to do anything other than be violent. And I think that is something that we don't want to observe in ourselves, but unless we're going to figure this out, we have to observe it within ourselves because this violence isn't just coming out of nowhere, it's in us. Same thing with like our sexual proclivities, our sexual behaviors. These are things within us. And when we take out the human side of it and kind of commercialize it and fetishize it and in some ways market the material, I want to say this word right, the materiality of it, or the material reality of it, I think we really kind of diminish something. And I think Worf and Klingons probably feel that way about humans when they see us in terms of our sexual behavior with each other. They probably look at us and Klingons look at humans and probably go, "Look at these whores. They are fucking each other left and right. They're not marrying each other. They're having children out of wedlock that are of different species and different races, and like they have no honor. They have no purity." And in some ways, the Klingons are very, very Puritan in this sense. Like the idea I just spent the last 5 minutes talking about how we kind of devalue sex. On the flip side of that, it's very puritanical to demand that another person automatically enter into some form of contractual relationship with you just because you had sex with them. Worf forcing marriage on Kalar is just as inappropriate as her telling Worf that what they did doesn't matter.
It's exactly where the conflict between the two cultures and their
Right.
value systems don't mesh. Right.
Well, like, it's interesting because they mesh when it comes to violence. They have this very violent scene right
Oh
before
yeah,
they have
that's a
sex.
good point. That's a good point.
And kind of taking a dovetail to a second, you asked a question like, do Klingons prefer edged weapons? Yes. Yes, they do. They don't prefer blasters. They don't prefer fighting on ships. They want to fight in hand-to-hand combat. There's multiple times in other episodes where they actually, I think there's one episode where like Klingons are actually going to go fight the Borg, and they're told their disruptors aren't going to work, and they all get really excited because they all get to pull out their batleths. So like they like the idea of running into a group of Borg with their batleths. So yeah, there is this kind of fetishization of edged weaponry.
Yes.
But Klingons have this very Klingons have what I was just talking about. They actually have a very familiar relationship with violence. And it's a key part of their society to the point where like it seems barbaric to us, but they've at least built a system of laws around violence to where like okay, people might get into a fight of honor and murder each other, but you're not allowed to actually stab someone in the back.
Your comment about violence in this country right now. I remember reading an article years ago. I don't know what publication it was in, and I'll probably get criticized for saying this, but it pointed out um, the difference in the United States national anthem with others.
Right.
That it's about a battle and it's very violent. And that the article was saying that, the fact that we chose that as our national anthem, not so much the tune, but the words, is just indicative of how warlike and violent we are. I mean,
Well,
think about just compare it to the United Kingdom, God Save the Queen, and and the one I think is I find it very moving is "Oh Canada."
yeah.
And the current verses, the denazified versions of Deutschland, the Deutschlandlied, which is the
Hmm.
German national anthem, Einigkeit und Recht und Freiheit, which is about freedom and human rights, whole different direction. It describes the country from what our national anthem's words say. And then some of the following verses get worse
Right.
because it brings slavery into it, and
Absolutely. No, you're correct. Look, I think that this is something that Q picks up on when uh, he first confronts the crew of the Enterprise in Encounter at Farpoint when he transforms into that U.S. soldier where he's like, it's about patriotism and fighting the communists.
yeah,
You know,
right.
the history of our country has always been punctuated by war. Like, even before the formation of our country during the Declaration of Independence, um, the colonies had just gone through the French and Indian War, which was a hugely violent conflict that we don't talk about in American history because we're so focused on the Revolution. But a lot of what led up to the revolution happened during the French and Indian War in terms of the British treatment of colonial soldiers and also Native Americans. Um, I think that our warlike culture is something we don't talk about because we would have to admit that the price of freedom in our mind is built on blood. In many ways, it is because what did Thomas Jefferson said that the tree of liberty has to be watered with the blood of patriots.
It may have been, yeah. Hmm.
Well, like, think about that. The tree of liberty has to be watered with the blood of patriots. The very conception of that is that to be free, at some point you may have to defend it with your life. America has always been set up with the idea that the rest of the world is run by tyrants.
It
And
was
because of our democracy, we are able to differentiate ourselves from that and from those tyrants. But at the same time, we've always paired this with this idea that we will defend ourselves and
well.
that we're
Here's
willing to go to war over it.
the
Yeah, sorry,
claim
go ahead.
is that Thomas Jefferson said it, and the whole quote is the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants.
Right.
So that's, I mean, adding that "add tyrants," uh, those two words
And
entirely changes the meaning, because what it's saying is that the reason the patriots are shedding blood is to put down the tyrants,
but
which talking about supposedly history repeating itself, the way this country's going, give it another 20 years, that might be happening again.
well, like, it's set up that way to have like not to go at TJ too hard on this one, but like, of course you're going to have to water the tree of liberty with the blood of tyrants and patriots because you're setting it up that way. Like, if you write the story where you have to refresh your country every so often by shedding blood, like, that's the story you're going to play out. It's somewhat of a self-fulfilling prophecy, and Star Trek really is kind of big in pushing past that narrative by saying oftentimes, like, look, we worked past this narrative of violence, we worked past this narrative of greed. We are out here trying to obtain a different sort of quality to our humanity that cannot be sustained just by the material reality around us. We need to find something greater and intrinsic within ourselves. And what we do, and the way we find that is by exploring the galaxy and determining what is within us, how what is within us is out there, and how what is out there makes us. And I think that, you know, we as a country haven't gotten to that yet. And part of that is, being able to maybe put down the idea that even if there are different sorts of governments and even different sorts of cultures out there that are antithesis to ours, they are not a threat to us because of our fidelity to our own ideals and the strength of our own character. I think one of the things that worries me about America sometimes is that we say that we are the strongest nation on earth, but we let the actions of everyone else affect us in such profound ways that if we are built on if we are living in this fortress, it's built on a mound of sand
One of the things I
because it
read
keeps
today
shifting.
that just kind of summarizes this. I found something that said, if you really want a Star Trek future, it's not just going to space in cool machines. It's building a society with respect for all life, sentient and otherwise, applying science wisely, and pursuing principles of justice, fairness, and reason. Let's build that and ride it to the stars.
Well, yeah, that's it exactly. Like there has to be an underlying philosophy, and you have to be very careful about what's in that philosophy because it really does play with unintended consequences if you don't. Like, let's look at it now. All of these QAnon people and all these people on Trump's side, these MAGA followers, like they honestly think that that a violent revolution is their inherent right because the founding fathers took part in it. Like the story of having a violent revolution is so key to them in terms of their American identity. They want to live that out, and that really is a reflection of the story that we tell.
That's
So
right.
if we want to fix the future, we really do need to think about the kind of story we're going to tell in terms of that future. Are we going to have it? How do we tell a story of how we deal with conflict in the future? What is the story we tell when it comes to dealing with violence, or the story we tell when it comes to dealing with sex or gender or politics? We have to be very careful about this because if we're not, I really do think that we're heading towards a worse future and farther from the possibility that Star Trek presents us. Um, and on that rant, let's get back to the show. Um, so, getting back to the Klingon custom and Worf trying to make the honorable decision to marry Kalar, and Kalar, being reluctant because she doesn't want to follow tradition. What Kalar really wants is Worf to tell her that he loves her on a human level, than just marry her on a basis of tradition. And I think this really gets into what we're talking about here when it comes to cultural differences. One thing that surprises me about us as humans is how we define love across the world. Here in America, and this isn't the case everywhere in America, of course, but we really do have a culture based on the idea that it really is one person finding another person and those two people deciding to have a relationship. Where in other places, like let's take Asia, let's take India for example, where they have a lot of prearranged marriages where two parents will meet and they may be family friends or they know each other professionally well. I even know that there are services in India that set families up,
Mm-hmm.
but
Right.
they will betroth their two young children to a future date where they will get married, and often these people will get married never having seen each other face to face until maybe a few days, maybe a day before the wedding. and there's a cultural expectation that these people will spend the rest of their lives with each other, bear children, form a household, pay bills, and be a part of society. Um, the way I just described it is not doesn't sound very threatening, but to a lot of people, the idea of a prearranged marriage, especially here in the West, is a very threatening idea that's kind of built on this inhuman notion that people are to be owned and sold and traded and commodified. But if you talk to people in India, they have a very different viewpoint of that, where some people think, well, my parents raised me to be this person, and they have the right to tell me who to marry because they have the best view of what my life is to be. I've actually heard people explain it to me that way. So it's interesting that we're seeing a discourse on the nature of love as it pertains to Klingons and humans, when here in the real world, here on Earth in 2021, we have those same kind of cultural differences too. I just don't think in 2021 they are as apparent um, to the zeitgeist as it seems it may have been in the past. What was the idea around marriage and love and kind of two people getting together and, maybe different forms of marriage or how marriages came together outside of that in like 1989? Do you recall any sort of cultural ideas or
Yeah, you're 20 years after the sexual revolution that happened in the 60s. So relationships are much more sexually open. Marriage was still understood as important for social stability. It was encouraged, although at that time, you know, it started to be couples that would cohabitate and wouldn't have children and wouldn't uh, 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 marry at all. Plus, you had starting probably, I don't know when the uptick was in the divorce rate, but by the late 70s, early 80s, one out of every two marriages could end up in divorce.
right?
So there was a lot of social concern about, you know, how people were not relating to one another as they did in the past. But, part of that was that back in the 30s, 40s, and even to the 50s, there was a stigma against people if they ended up getting divorced. And
Hmm.
that after that time, things really, that stigma kind of went away.
Well, can I ask you a personal question?
Sure.
Many people probably listening to this won't know, but I'm actually my I and my younger sister, Catherine, are actually the products of your second marriage. I actually have an older sister named Michelle from your first marriage. So, if you're willing to talk about it, if you're not, we can continue on with the show. But did you face any stigma when you went through your first divorce in the 80s?
You meant my only divorce.
Yeah, your only divorce. Sorry.
No, I really didn't.
Okay.
I really didn't. Nothing else to say.
So,
It's just that simple.
do you remember anyone being stigmatized around you for getting divorced?
Um, I cannot specifically remember people that I knew getting stigmatized.
Okay, so I'm glad you answered that because for me, when it comes to marriage, I remember. So when we were living in St. Louis in the '90s, one thing that I remember, I won't mention their names, but I think you'll remember them. But I was friends with two boys, and both of their families went through horrible divorces. And in many ways, it felt like when I was going up through elementary school in St. Louis, a lot of people's parents were getting divorced at that time in the '90s. And it really felt like no one was able to pin down why it was happening or why marriages were failing. And a lot of kids sometimes, I think, were made to feel or thought naturally because, children have this immature thought sometimes and maybe a little bit of self centeredness, but maybe the fault for their parents' divorces lay with them, which,
Right.
really isn't the case.
Right. Yeah.
Unless those parents are shitty people, which happens. But um, it never felt like to me that marriage was actually held up as this sacred thing as much as it was like keeping your marriage sacred and keeping it going and keeping it healthy. And strangely, it always felt like divorce was when people get divorced, we kind of speak of it as an inevitability. But before they get divorced, no one ever speaks of it as an inevitability. Like, no one ever floats the idea, like, well, these people are obviously going to fail. But when they do fail, we all act like, well, of course they failed. And I think that that's just a very strange thing that we do, even in 2021, when it comes to people's relationships. It's almost like we don't know how to just like we don't know how to really begin things. I don't think we really have figured out a comfortable way to end things either.
That's a
I
very
think that's
good
a
point.
very
Yeah,
and I think that's a very human thing that we're still
it
dealing
is.
with.
Sure. Yes.
And I think that's reflected here in the episode because, Worf and Kalar have a decision, and in some ways, every decision is an ending, but it's also a beginning for them. Um, by deciding to get married, Worf is committing himself to a completely different life potentially, and by Kalar asking Worf to say he loves her before she acquiesces to such a thing, which she says she's willing to do in the future. They're both having to put things in the past to the side to make that happen, to have that new beginning.
Yeah, I think what happened when they were in the uh, at the um, she was ready to beam over to the Tong. That Worf basically told Kalar that he loved her, but he
Yeah,
didn't
give her
use
what she
that
wanted.
words. When he said, "I will not be complete without you," I mean that was his way of not using just say, "I love you, je t'aime," whatever. So,
Yeah,
and at the same time, he kind of accepted her reluctance because of her Klingon human conflict, that it wasn't an honor thing with him, with her, and that she tells him that basically she's dedicated to him. So they kind of end up being almost married, but it's not official
betrothed.
because they haven't taken the oath. Right.
Right. Well, I think the way this ends is very good between them because it does show. I think at the basis of all relationships, and Ben, if you're listening to this, there comes a point in every romantic relationship or every partnership between you and whoever you decide to be with that you have to make the decision that that person is worth it despite their difficulties or the hurdles that you might face being together. And through this experience, it's very clear that both Worf and Kalar, despite their cultural differences, despite their differences in perception about how relationships are supposed to be or how they're supposed to act in terms of being Klingon or being human, they're willing to go through those hurdles at some later date. And if anything, they're accepting that like the moment she beams over to the Tong, they're taking the first hurdle right then and there. Um, this event, however, does lead to Kalar getting pregnant with Worf's son, Alexander. Um, looking back on it and some of the things they do later on the show, I have to say that this is kind of a clumsy way to get Alexander in there. Just because they've built into the show later on that like contraceptives are readily available. It seems that people are taking these contraceptives daily, and it seems kind of odd that like Kalar would be. I don't want to say she's foolish enough to get pregnant, but it seems like someone who's a working woman full time in a very high stressed, high capacity, very powerful position as the ambassador to the Klingon Empire probably does not want to get knocked up. in the line of duty because it might take her out of duty. And at the same time, I don't think Worf wants to go around impregnating ambassadors. It seemed like there was a lot of thoughtlessness
In terms
behind
of the story writing, sort of.
well, yeah, like the actual, like the real ramifications of what this would be like in the
Well,
real world.
the other thing, just in terms of the kind of the awkwardness of the story, I don't know whether it's season 3 or season 4 where
Season
Alexander
3.
shows up, but he's a couple years old. He's like 6 or 7 years old.
Oh yeah, you're
It
right.
seems like, and it's like, and Kalar didn't let Worf know that she had his child after all that time. That's a little bit bizarre.
Well, on top of her not letting him know, it also gets into the question of like, what is the legal status of these kids in the future when it comes to like determining proper custody of parentship? Like, Kalar didn't tell Worf. What if something had happened to her before she saw Worf again to introduce Alexander to him? What happens to that little boy if like Worf never runs into him?
Then he goes into the Klingon orphan system.
But that's the thing. Like, did Kalar write a will just in case something happened? Like, there's a lot of, and of course, like I want to get back to the world building point. Everyone has some sort. Men and women in the future both take contraceptives or take some sort of birth control to stop this sort of thing. In fact, Benjamin Sisko and I'm sorry, folks at home. I'm going to forget his wife's name at the moment. She appears in season 5. Um, but Benjamin Sisko actually forgets to take his birth control and impregnates his wife later in the season. So, like, these contraceptives are readily available. I kind of actually think the Kalar getting pregnant in this episode and it being revealed later on is just sloppy.
Mm-hmm.
And,
Mm-hmm.
it feels like they looking at this episode, which I think by itself is great. The future decision to reveal that like Worf impregnated her and all that, I think really causes a lot of undue and unneeded complication, and actually does away with a lot of the good work this episode
Yeah,
did.
right. There's one other thing that we need to touch on is how Klingon Guile shows up when
With the Tong.
with the Tong when Worf comes up with the plan as to how they can convince the commander of the Tong that they're no longer at war and you need to stand down and so forth. And it ties in, like we said, with the issue of whether Worf was bluffing, which he really was when he was playing cards with Data and the others. And actually, the whole scenario where they, saved the situation with the Tong was a big bluff.
Yeah.
It was not even a bluff. It was subterfuge also.
Well, the main tension of this point of concern in the story is Kalar believes that these Klingons are just going to wake up and be violent, and there's no talking to them. That they are bred during an era of warfare where they are just savages, and you need to give them the honor of a good and quick death.
And they're not going to surrender. Yes.
Worf believes culturally that if they're warriors, they actually have the capacity to recognize that that change has happened and have the ability to stand down. Worf has the ability to believe that warriors are in control of themselves, where Kalar thinks that warriors are not in control of themselves.
That's an
And I
interesting
think the
point.
way Worf does that and points that out is, using the Klingon Guile by presenting a mixed crew on the Enterprise when the Enterprise finally does confront the Tong. Because it's a very good scene where the captain finally, like, the view screen pops open and the first thing that you see is the captain looking around and going like, what is this? What is going on? Why are there Klingons sitting among these humans, and let alone Klingons leading these humans on a Starfleet vessel? Um, I think it's back to what we were saying earlier in the episode. The moment you see people interacting with each other in ways that are unexpected, it really does change your viewpoint. And Worf has this belief that the crew of the Tong have the ability, if shown something completely shocking to their senses, to make a decision then and there to change. Yes, he bluffs them into the worry of, like, oh, this is a bigger ship, I have a better crew, we're in the future, we'll just
Hmm.
destroy you.
Hmm.
But deep down, I think Worf has the faith in his own people that Kalar doesn't have, that they're going to be able to recognize that something is different and be
Hmm.
able to make a
Hmm.
change based off that.
Hmm.
It's not even necessarily guile, I don't think. I think it really is kind of. I think Worf has faith that there is a way to fight for a better position than the one he's been given. And I think that that is something unique to characters like him, and I think it's unique to heroic characters in general. I think I think the beauty of the Star Trek stories, and I think you really see this if you start watching Discovery, and you'll see this in Voyager a lot too. They really come into a lot of these rock and a hard place situations where they really do have to decide. Most people decide when they get into the rock and the hard place situation, okay, am I going to run into the rock or am I going to run into the hard place? The decision a Starfleet officer makes is that I'm going to figure out a way to do neither and get out of this. I'm going to use my smarts, I'm going to do the work, kind of like The Martian by Andy Weir.
Well, it's the whole Kobayashi Maru idea concept.
Exactly. There's
Yeah,
no losing scenario.
right.
And I think that that's a very important thing to distinguish when it comes to Worf, in the fact that, like, I really don't think he's bluffing. It may seem like he did in that situation, but I don't think so. I think what he did was just he saw an opponent and he decided, I'm going to defeat them without firing a shot, and I'm just going to trick them to do it. It's not guile in the sense of I am I'm completely pulling the wool over these people's eyes. He didn't really lie to him. There really is peace between the Federation and the Klingons. The Federation and the Klingons really are working together. I mean, this is that they're on the mission where it's literally a Klingon ambassador sitting next to him.
Right, right.
He doesn't lie a single minute of
Well, I
that
guess it's the other
situation.
thing that if they would have let the Tong go, that
Right.
it would have, destroyed all these
Colonies.
colonies. So if the commander of the Tong didn't stand down, um, Worf had really put himself into a choice that he would have had to destroy the Tong.
And I think he would have too.
And so it's somewhat of a bluff where he thought, I think the captain will realize that things are different, so he'll stand down. And at the same time, it was a bluff, but if it didn't work, he went to plan B right away.
Well, plan B really is pull out Batleth.
Yes.
Um, well, I have to say, philosophically, this is why I've always liked the Worf character. And philosophically, I agree with the Worf character on a lot of things. Um, I do think that there is something deceptive about bluffing. And I do think that, when we talk about guile, it is really a murky subject. Because, you and I are having a slight disagreement about whether this is guile or not.
Sure.
But I think what's going on here, and what I really respect, is that Worf is giving his opponent two decisions. You can either make peace here right now and listen, or we can fight. There's no dishonesty in that. It's either peace or war. And that's what he's offering. And I think that there is such a purity of honesty in that, again, I don't think that this is guile. I think Worf is willing to follow through on every part of this.
Well, I'm just looking at some definitions of the word guile, and that one
Okay.
statement here is that people who have guile are thought of as being wily, sneaky, and deceitful. So it really does have guile does have a negative connotation overall.
Hmm. Well, it's funny. I looked up, is guile a negative word?
Yes.
And at vocabulary.com, the first thing that they say is that the noun guile has quite negative connotations, as it refers to the kind of knowledge and skill that can be used by comic book villains for evil and not good. People who have guile are thought of as being wily, which is also a related word, and
That
as
was
you said,
that.
sneaky and deceitful.
That's exactly the website I was reading from. Yes.
Okay, so we're looking at the same thing.
Yep. Yep.
So yeah, I'm not sure guile is necessarily the right term here, but even Worf
Yeah.
is using it too.
Mm-hmm.
And he will actually use it in the next episode as
He
well.
does. Yes, he does.
So one last thing before we go, because I think we've covered everything for the
Yeah,
most part.
I think so.
Where does Kalar get her amazing wardrobe? Um, I think it's obvious, and it's been stated many times that actually, it hasn't been stated in this series yet, but it is stated in DS9 and Voyager that they do replicate their clothing, even to the point of using the replicators as like their laundry system.
Well, I'm glad you answered that practical question because that was a question I had when Luoxana Troy came on, and she had that one case, and she has all of these, dresses that have just yards, voluminous material in
Hmm.
them. It's like maybe Mr. Hong could compress them down into little pellets or something like that. But the same thing with Kalar. It's like, where does she get her red sexy outfit? Because she certainly didn't have a suitcase or a storage area in that little tube, warp tube probe that she arrived in. And then,
Right,
where did the Klingon costumes come at the end when Kalar and Worf are in their full Klingon battle rattle?
right. Um, I have to imagine that they replicate all of it, unless they have some sort of massive wardrobe on the ship.
No, I mean, we know that at Paramount Studios they had all the costumes and so forth, but in terms of the Star Trek world, yes, I think they'd have to have a replicator of some sort.
Before we go, can we just talk about Suzie Plakson, who plays Kalar, and how good of an actress she is? She's appeared in a bunch of things. I just wanted to note some of the roles that she's played in Star Trek. She's played Dr. Solar during The Schizoid Man, that she was great in. She plays Kalar. She also plays the female Q in Voyager in The Q and the Gray, which you'll watch later on. She also plays Tara, who is God, who is the Andorian counterpart to Commander Shran's second
Oh
in
yeah,
Enterprise?
yes.
She's just a fantastic actress, and, and I think that she's just so good in everything that she's in. And I really wish that there had been some way to make her a regular on the show because the writers and producers really liked her too.
hmm hmm No, that's an interesting thing because when I'm looking at a lot of next generation using Prime, Amazon Prime, or the same thing with if you do DS9 or Voyager
Hmm.
on Prime, there's you can hit the screen, and whoever's in the scene, the name of the character and the corresponding actor's name will show up. So sometimes I've gotten in the habit of just learning about who these people are, and yeah, so yeah, she has a Suzie Plakson. Just looking, she has a Wikipedia page. She's got a she was in, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, through
She's
88 to
been in a lot.
2005. She's been in 6 different movies, big screen movies, but going back as far as 1987, she's been fairly uh, busy on a number of
Yeah,
television shows, and she's done some video game work also.
yeah. I think she's fantastic.
Hmm
Just a great actress.
hmm
So on that note, I think that we are done for tonight. Thank
Sure.
you, Dad, for joining me for a great episode.
Thank you. You're
As I
welcome.
said, I really do love the Emissary. We will be back next time for Peak Performance, episode 21 of season 2. We'll see everyone then. Thanks, Dad.
Bye bye. Good night.
Night.